So the basic components of the 100-hour service are mainly you're changing fluids and filters, and you're this is the best time to get the overall overview of the motor, see how it's doing health-wise. So you're changing out gear oil. When you drop your gear oil out, take a look at it, see what it looks like. That's an important clue of what's going on inside your gear case. Motor oil, oil filter, those are the basic steps. And then fuel filtration. Fuel filtration is critical to the health of the motor. You have an external fuel water separator in most boats that comes standard now, and then you also have another fuel water filter that's on the motor itself, and those will all be changed out during the annual service. So we're preparing to drop the gear oil out of the gear case, and for that I usually use these tools in the shop. This is an impact driver and good old-fashioned ball peen hammer. You at home probably have a nice long screwdriver flathead laying around, and if you use that in conjunction with a wrench that can turn it, you've got enough control and mechanical advantage to deal with these screws without stripping them out. That is something you really need to watch out for. Some of these screws can be very stubborn when you're trying to back them out, and if you strip them, you have a serious problem right off the bat. And so I use the impact driver because I know it's not going to strip anything, because it's going to bottom out and lock itself into the screw. So we're going to line it up with our slot here. Give it a little tap. Another little tap. This one's stubborn. Try not to knock my face off, and there we go. Okay, and now we're just going to back out the vent screw. And again, pull the screw out. Make sure you got a gasket that comes out with it, or go find the gasket. Stubborn little bugger. Here we go. Once this vent screw comes out, oil is likely to start pouring out of the bottom of the gear case very quickly. So again, make sure you're clear, make sure whatever containment you're using is in place. So our gear oil here definitely smells nice and burnt, so we know it's got a good number of hours on it. I'm not really seeing much in the way of water contamination, so that tells me, generally speaking, that our seals are probably intact, and there's no need to go down that road as far as checking for anything in the way of blown out seals, which is obviously good news. If you drop your gear oil out of here and first thing you see coming out of here is clear running water, you have a problem, and definitely need to figure out which of your gear case seals is blown and replace them as soon as possible. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I have seen clear running water come out of here. And since it's heavier than oil, it's going to sit in the bottom of the gear case, and as soon as you pull that bottom screw, there it goes. But you can have it go the complete spectrum from clear water to something that looks like a milkshake. And if you see that milkshake as opposed to a nice dark honey color or black, then yeah, you've got some sort of water contamination in there, and again, it needs to be addressed. Just pulling the plastics off the motor. On this particular Yamaha, you need a 5mm hex fitting, and then you can pull these little screws out. Some of the other V6s have just a 10mm regular hex bolt. These are just a regular socket. So get these off. So important thing here, when you're removing these, sometimes they're sticky, they don't want to come off. Don't just yank on the wire. If you can, get your fingers wrapped around the actual pencil coil itself, and you can pull on the wire, but try to only pull on this. Very, very light pressure on here. What you don't want to do is tear your coils up. So here we are, pulling spark plugs. I like to use my electric impact to remove spark plugs. I do not like to use my electric impact to install spark plugs. There are just too many ways where you can have a really bad mistake take place that will certainly ruin your day. So while I'm pulling spark plugs out, I want to look at the plugs and get an idea of the overall condition of them. Spark plugs give you one of the better clues of the health of the inside of what's going on in your cylinders and the inside of the motor. So you want to really pay attention there. So I pull them off, keep them in order. when I got them all off, I'll take a look at them and see what we have. Okay, so in my right hand I have the spark plugs out of cylinders 1, 3, and 5, and in my left hand I have the spark plugs from cylinders 2, 4, and 6. And what I'd love to see is everything having a nice coloration like these two. Everything matches and is nice and even. And for the most part, 4 of them look good. They look relatively close to each other. But there are 2 of them that you can see are a lot darker here. That could be, generally speaking, that could be a sign of carbon buildup inside the motor. And it's definitely something to look out for. Certainly if it was really dark, really black, really gunked up, at that point I would say, you know, we got carbon buildup inside this motor that's maybe warrants some further attention in the form of a decarb or something like that. But for now, what we're going to do, keeping all this in mind, we're going to do what we do with every 100-hour service or annual service and take compression on the motor. Okay, getting ready to take compression on the motor. So using a regular run-of-the-mill compression gauge, Craftsman, and then I have also added to it for Yamaha and Suzuki 4-strokes the attachment for extended reach spark plugs. So if you are using the regular 2-stroke fitting, you will not be able to get a bite on these. You will need to find something with an extended reach set of threads on it. So we're going to thread it in. Now we're going to go up to the controls, move the throttle to wide open, and pull the kill switch out so there's no spark going to the motor. We're just going to spin her over. Each cylinder 6 or 7 revolutions, and just come back here, check our reading, do the same thing for all 6 cylinders. Okay, got 180 psi on cylinder number 1. That's pretty good, especially for a cold compression. So that sounds good, and we're just going to keep on moving through the other cylinders. Alright, we just got finished doing cylinder compression on the block here, and average was about 170, 175. For a cold motor, I'm willing to live with that and move on through the other parts of the service. So the next thing I'm going to do is pull out motor oil, and at this point we'll have motor oil and gear oil out. Go ahead and get the filters out of the way, which is an oil filter and the fuel filters, and we're well on our way to wrapping up the 100-hour. Okay, so I'm getting ready to evacuate the oil out of this motor, out of the oil pan here, and I use an evacuator to basically pull it out through the dipstick tube. Other people want to use the drain pan, drain screw, and crush washer and all that stuff. I usually try to leave that stuff alone. For me, this is a cleaner, neater process, and I can basically get this thing moving and pulling oil out and move on to some other things while it's pulling oil, because this motor is probably going to take a few minutes to get the oil out. So put this in, let it bottom out in the oil pan, and then go ahead and start pulling. You can find these oil evacuators at most marine supply places like a West Marine or something like that. They have a huge range in prices. They're all fairly effective for this purpose. So now just going to make sure that I got oil coming out of there, and I do. So we're going to move on to some other parts of the job. Alright, so now we're putting our new spark plugs in. And for that, I change out my spark plug socket and just use a regular 5/8 on a for 4 strokes. And I just spin these in by hand until they bottom out. I don't use ratchets. I don't use any sort of mechanical assistance whatsoever. I just spin them all the way in until they bottom out, and then I torque them to about 20 foot-pounds, and then we're done. Then we're moving on to the next step. Alright, so my torque wrench to 20 foot-pounds. I've already bottomed out all 6 plugs, and now I'm just going back through, tighten them down, so I hear that click, and I know we're good to go. So another little tip, something I picked up when I was working in Yamaha dealerships that I think is really useful. Yamaha makes a product called YamaShield. You can find it at any parts desk. Any Yamaha parts desk will carry this stuff. And I like to spray down the entire block, but I pay attention particularly to the electronics and electronic connections. This stuff is absolute must for the long-term protection, anti-corrosion, corrosion resistance on your motor. I have worked with numerous motors over the years where I saw the same motor come back year in, year out, year in, year out, and I've always been fairly regular using this stuff, and you'd be amazed at how well it can preserve the metal and the electrical connections on a motor if it's applied regularly. So here I've just finished seating all of my spark plug leads, and I'm just going to, before I put the plastic cover back on, just going to give it a quick spray, nice even, quick film. You want to keep it out of the belts up high. You want to just make sure that it's focused down here in the electronics and in the area where this whole area tends to stay wet and tends to stay salty, as you know, especially down here in the pan. It's not uncommon to see some salt stacking up. So I get our sensors down here, protect them as well as we can, and move on to the next step. So I'm going to bolt the plastic cover back on. This area is closed up, and we're ready to move on to the next aspect of the service. Okay, mounting bolts for our plastic cover and bolts for anything that attach to this motor. Once you've gotten them off, that's wonderful. You want to make sure they continue to come off into the indefinite future. Just a little dab of grease on the threads before you thread these back in. It will go a very, very long way towards keeping these from seizing up. Okay, now we're going to change the oil filter, and on the 3.3 Yamahas you have an oil filter location, which is at a not the best place that it could be, which is up under here under the intake plastics. And to get to it, first you have to remove this plastic cover, and then you need to spin the filter off. When you spin the filter off, oil is going to come out, and it is really, really easy to make a huge mess. So for that, I use this little funnel, which is flexible, and this jar. And when I'm ready to pull the filter out, I will lift the motor up, spin the filter off just the last couple of threads and let it come loose, and just hold everything in place while I drain that oil out. And then as the oil stops draining, I can get the new filter in place. Alright, so I'm going to turn the motor up. Get into a relatively decently comfortable position. Get something down there to catch. In this case, our handy dandy mason jar. And I'm going to use a pick, which can bite into that metal a little bit and just spin it loose. I've already broken it loose with the wrench, so it's just basically hand tight. Should come loose fairly easily without too much of a fight. As soon as that filter, that seal on that filter breaks loose, should see a fair amount more oil coming out. And there we go. Now, I don't know if you can see this with the camera, but inside this filter is absolutely full of oil. And if you break this filter loose with the motor full trim down, it will dump all of this oil right into the pan on the motor. And like I said, you will see it running out down below for a very long time into the future unless you find some way to clean it up. Filter, attach, do my bidding, and we will be friends. Okay, the last thing I do there is I take a look around the oil filter and make sure there's no like zip ties or anything that gets worked in there. Sometimes you get some debris trapped in there between the filter seal and the seating surface, the seal surface itself, and you will develop a very fast oil leak when you go to test the motor. So we're all good there. Now I'll go ahead and put our plastic cover back on. Now I'm just backing out our little 10 millimeter bolts that hold the bracket on that holds the motor's fuel filter. So last one's coming off now, and then we'll go ahead and remove the filter and replace it. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and pull our filter loose here. This is the old school Yamaha filter. The new one has the electric lead that is the fuel water sensor in it. Very important note, when you are spinning the new style filter off, which would have a little power lead coming out of the bottom here, make sure you disconnect that lead and spin the lead with the filter cup so that you don't twist the wiring up and sever the wiring. If you damage it, it's an extremely expensive part for something that looks so simple. Okay, so we have our filter element out of the filter cup. If you have the older style filter that has this high-tech piece of equipment to let you know if you have water in your filter cup, then you will have an O-ring inset down inside the filter. That is to be reused. So take a pick, gently remove the O-ring, and then when you get your new filter, stick that same O-ring back in there, more or less like this. Make sure that it's in a good spot. Go back like this. And if you're really good at not making a mess, which I am usually not, you can just go right back over with your cup. It's always good to take a little bit of grease around that O-ring on the top of the filter cup. Maybe put a little bit of grease on these threads, just because they like to seize up. Even though it's plastic and metal and da-da-da, they will, over years they can really get stubborn. So, very important also to make sure you don't cross thread this. Cross threads are not your friend at all. Alright, now our brackets go back on. This little piece right here is notched out. It is meant to slip over that little tab on the ring there that fastens the filter cup into place. You hold it in place, snug it on. Now, this point, I do not mount this all back into place. I want to disconnect the incoming fuel line that's coming from the fuel tank, because this is the easiest way to reprime the fuel system. Because in just a minute, as you see, we are going to remove the fuel water separator. And at that point, the fuel system will lose prime inside the boat. When in doubt, you really want to mess up some metal pry on it. This may be pressurized, so keep it away from your face. Set these things where they will not spill. Alright, now we're going to go after our fuel water separator. This is the item down here in the corner. Use a regular filter wrench like you can get at any auto parts store. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, so we had to pull this bracket loose because I didn't have a clearance to get a filter wrench on it. There was a hose getting in the way. But this brings up an important consideration, that it's probably better that this bracket is loose so that I can show you more easily. So you're spinning your filter off. Gas will leak out of here. So have a cloth ready. You want to catch any gas. Try not to let it leak all over the bilge. You want to get that element loose. And after you've got the filter out, next step is you want to inspect the mating surface on the bottom of the bracket. So here's our filter coming out. Now we're going to look at the bottom of the bracket. This is a nice bracket. It's been in service for a long time. But as you can see, can you get a view of that surface there? That's where the gasket's going to seat. Okay, you see right here, this still has nice, really smooth, shiny finish on it. On these filter brackets, they will build up corrosion and gunk. And if this bracket was still mounted in place on the wall, on the transom here, like this, if it was still mounted in place, you want to take your finger, after you've got the filter off, take your finger, run it around on that gasket surface. If you feel debris or stuff, gunk, it'll make it to where the new filter seal itself won't quite seal all the way, and you'll be pulling air into your fuel system as opposed to just nice clean fuel. Once you start pulling air, you will certainly develop a running problem, usually not too long after the air starts getting into the fuel system. So we're going to spin on our new filter, basically about as tight as we can get it by hand. Then we're going to go back up to the motor and prime the fuel system. Okay, at this point we have replaced our primary filter on here, and we have replaced our fuel water separator filter in the boat. Now, like I said before, we've lost prime in the fuel system, and we have to prime it back up, fill up the fuel water canister to make sure that we don't have a big air bubble trying to airlock in the motor. There's a couple ways to go about it. One way is to physically fill the fuel filter element up itself with gas. It makes it easier. But what I do is I just take our fuel line into the motor here. After I've dumped out the used fuel water element, stick our line back in there, and just start pumping away on the primer bulb. It's a bit of a tedious method. There are other ways to do it. You can put a pump on here that'll vacuum, that'll pull the fuel through this line with a vacuum, but it's usually destructive to whatever you use to vacuum, to pull it through with a vacuum. So this is going to take a minute or so, but you'll feel it when the primer bulb starts to slosh around. You know you got fuel in there, and then it'll push fuel out into the filter, and you'll be ready to go. There we go. All right, now gas is pushing through here. Get a few good squeezes. We've got fuel line is all nice and primed up and happy. Now we're going to add motor oil to the motor. We've changed out our oil filters, drained the oil out, the old oil, and we're ready to just go back and fill up with the good stuff. I use this in my shop. This is from a company called Oil Safe. They sell these products at any industrial supply, and for me it's just a way to minimize the chance of spilling oil all over the place. Yamaha is kind enough to let you know how much oil the motor needs right there on your engine plastics. So just check that out. It's a really helpful thing they do. A lot of the other manufacturers make you search around a little bit more. Alright, we're fairly well topped off there. So now we're going to fill up gear oil. For that I have just a regular little hand pump like you can find anywhere, and with a Yamaha fitting attached to the end of it. And we're just going to thread it into the bottom here very carefully so as not to damage any metal. Don't force it, just gently thread it in there. And the good thing about these little pumps is they're cheap. The bad thing is it takes longer. It's always nicer having a 5-gallon bucket that will fill this gear case in about 30 seconds. But if you don't, this works just fine. Tech tip, oil levels. We are topping off gear oil here in this gear case. So when it gets full, you'll see oil come out of there. Let some keep pushing oil through there and let some bubbles push through. Because a lot of times oil will splash out and keep bubbling. But that's just air bubbles pushing through. A few more drops and then we're good to go. Now the first thing we're going to do So we're going to put in our vent screw first with our new gasket right there on the screw. Carefully thread this in. Now, as I said before, it's very easy to tear up the aluminum housing on this. It's very easy to strip off the screw. So the easiest thing to do is get a little wrench, fit it to your screwdriver, just snug it in. Don't over torque it, just get it in nice and snug. Next thing I'm going to do is trim the motor back up a little bit so I can get our lower drain screw back in place. This part can get messy if you're not careful. So what I do now is I'm just going to let our little fill hose go down in the reservoir there. And if you don't get to this fast, it will start dropping out big globs of gear oil. So again, you just want to carefully wind it back into place. And you feel it give you some resistance. Use your wrench to snug it up a little bit, and you're done. Okay, now we just wipe the gear case off and we're done. And then we're on to pull the prop, check out prop seals, grease the prop shaft, and that would wrap up our 100-hour service. Alright, so now one of the last steps in our annual service is we're going to pull the propeller off, inspect the prop shaft and prop seals, get everything greased up, and then everything's going to go back together hopefully. There we go. Those dents in the prop, not on me, not on me. Is that on film? Sticking by that. Okay, this is one of the reasons why we go to this trouble. Well, we've pulled the propeller off, we've pulled off the thrust washer, and we're checking in behind it to check the prop seals. And as you can see here, this particular propeller, this prop shaft, has accumulated a generous quantity of braided fishing line. This stuff, if it's allowed to sit there and do its thing long enough, will completely shred the seals down here, and that guarantee you that you need to have a reseal on your gear case. Okay, so now we're taking our last steps in our annual service here. We're just hitting all the grease fittings on the motor. So you have one in the pilot tube here, which is critical. This needs to definitely be serviced annually. Make sure it's got good fresh grease through and push through it, because this thing can seize, and it is a nightmare to deal with if the pilot tube seizes up on any outboard. And then we also have fittings here in the tilt tube, one here on the starboard side and the other one on the port side. So we're just going to fill these guys up. The pilot tube, I fill it up with grease until I hear grease and air and bubbles and water and stuff pushing out of the top of the tube. You really want to check the top of the tube always. If you got grease pushing out of there, you're usually in good shape. So we should see some grease starting to push out of there soon. I don't care about the water and the air bubbles. I want the water out of there. But I want to see grease physically push out of that top bushing there. Looks like we're pretty close. I'm seeing the old grease pushing out. Okay, that's probably good there. And now we're greasing the tilt tube fittings. Usually it only requires a few pumps, and then you'll see grease pushing out around the bushings here and these washers. Move over to our other side and we are done. Alright, that's it. So one of the last things that gets done with an annual service is you take a look at the zinc anodes on the motor and see if they're ready for replacement. As you can see, our trim tab zinc here is pretty chalky and looks like it's ready for replacement. And check our other one over down here, the bracket zinc, and it's pretty chalky too. And both of these guys are going to need to be replaced before I let this boat go back. Okay, so at this point we have wrapped up our 100-hour or annual service on the motor. So just to recap, we have swapped out oil, motor oil, gear oil, gaskets, spark plugs. We've basically replaced all the filtration, oil and fuel filtration. We've primed up our fuel system, which is critically important. And then the next step is to run the motor for a little while in a tank or in the water and just make sure it's doing its thing. And that really wraps everything up.
All right, you're rolling here.
We're not using this. This is